She never cried for help. A limping waitress barely noticed, carrying 10 years of silence behind her smile. No ID, no bank account, no home of her own, just debt and cold floors. And no one cared. Until a retired millionaire and his old German shepherd stepped through the door. He saw nothing. But the dog? He saw everything. What followed was not just rescue, it was redemption.
No.
What happens next will break your heart and heal it in the same breath. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe no one deserves to suffer in silence, if you believe in quiet heroes with 4 legs and loyal hearts, hit that subscribe button. This story will stay with you forever. In the icy grip of late December, the small town of Silver Hollow, Oregon, sat wrapped in silence under thick layers of snow. The sun had vanished behind a curtain of low, gray clouds that diffused the light into a pale, bluish haze, casting long shadows over the crooked rooftops and narrow roads. Snowflakes fell slow and wide, catching in the bare limbs of maples and pine. This town, tucked deep in the Cascade foothills, had always been more wilderness than suburb, a forgotten patch on the map, where time moved slower and memories refused to melt away. A rusty black Ford F-250 pulled into the near-empty lot of Molly's Diner, its tires crunching through frozen slush. The engine sighed to silence, and for a moment the town exhaled. From the passenger side, a large German shepherd leapt down first. His coat, once a deep sable, had faded with time to a dusty blend of black and tawny brown. His right ear stood proudly while the left bent slightly at the tip, the result of a training injury years ago. A faint scar ran across his ribs, barely visible under winter fur, and his gait bore the dignity of one who had endured much and spoken of little. His name was Asher, named not for a person or a storybook, but for what remained after the fire. 10 years ago, when the cabin had burned and Thomas Hale's world crumbled into ash with the death of his wife Elena, this dog had found him in the woods, half collapsed, holding a bottle and nothing else. Asher had licked his face until he moved, nudged him until he stood, and guarded him through the long, bitter night. It was Elena who had once said, "If anything happens, let something survive and bring you back." Asher had done just that. From that day on, the name stuck. Ash, but standing. Thomas Hale, now 58, stepped out of the truck with a stiffness that spoke not just of age, but of guilt carried in the shoulders. He was tall and lean, with a salt and pepper beard trimmed close and eyes the color of old slate. The lines on his face weren't carved by laughter, but by restraint. A man who once ruled venture capital meetings in Seattle, Thomas now wore denim, a waxed cotton jacket, and boots caked with mud and salt. He'd returned to Silver Hollow not out of nostalgia, but because something inside him had gone quiet, and the only way to wake it was to retrace the pain. Molly's Diner was one of the last places open after 9 p.m. in this town. It looked the same as it did a decade ago. Fluorescent bulbs buzzing behind frosted glass, a flickering open all night sign humming with defiance. Thomas hesitated at the door, hand resting on the push bar, and looked down at Asher. The dog sat beside him, tail twitching lightly, waiting for the unspoken signal. They entered together. Inside, the warmth hit hard grease-laced heat from a kitchen that had seen better days. The floor tiles were cracked in places, and the countertop near the register was covered with a thin plastic film that had begun to yellow. The walls were hung with black and white photos of loggers and railway tracks, now dimmed by years of coffee steam and cigarette ghosts. A few late diners were scattered about. A man in a beanie nursing tomato soup, a teenage girl scrolling through her phone with earbuds in, and an old couple asleep over split pie. At the far end, near the counter, a woman emerged carrying a metal tray. She walked with a distinct tilt, her right leg braced clumsily under dark jeans. Her stride was careful, almost practiced, and she leaned subtly on her left hip to offset the pain. Her name was June Miller, 29, waitress since 17, and the niece of the diner's owner. She had a narrow face, freckled under the faded lights, and long auburn hair pulled into a tired braid that hung over one shoulder. Her eyes, gray like rain, carried a softness often mistaken for weakness. June approached the new customer without fanfare. She set a glass of water on the table with a silent precision that spoke volumes. No clatter, no shifting of the salt and pepper shakers, just a steady hand that had learned how not to disturb. Thomas looked up just as Asher did. The German shepherd rose slowly and stepped toward June, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. He sniffed the air, then her leg, pausing at the joint where the cloth brace wrapped around Old Damage. Asher whined softly, not a bark, just a low, empathetic sound that made June freeze. She looked down, unsure whether to smile or step away. "He's gentle," Thomas offered, voice low and even. "I can see that," June said, kneeling slightly. Asher met her eyes, then gently laid his head against her thigh for just a breath. Then he returned to Thomas's side, calm again. June straightened and wiped her hands on her apron, visibly affected. "You two passing through?" Thomas hesitated. "Something like that. Been a while. What can I get you?" "Just coffee." She nodded, and for a moment their eyes met. Something unspoken passed through the air recognition not of each other, but of lives shaped by long silences. As she walked away, Thomas whispered to Asher, "You saw it too." The rest of the night passed slowly. June delivered the coffee wordlessly. Asher lay curled beside Thomas's feet, eyes always on her. When she bent to clean a table, her limp more pronounced, Asher tilted his head. When she winced, reaching for a tray, he stirred, ears flicking with concern. Thomas left a generous tip under the saucer not for the service, but for the silence, the care, the burden. Outside, the snow had begun again. Fat flakes fell through the amber streetlight glow. Asher stopped at the edge of the parking lot, looked back toward the diner. Thomas followed his gaze and for a brief moment saw June through the window standing still, her hand pressed lightly against her leg, as if remembering something she'd rather forget. The snow didn't stop in Silver Hollow, it only changed its rhythm. By early January, the town felt buried in a silence so complete it bordered on sacred. In the diner windows, warm light spilled into the swirling flurries, fogging the glass from within. Silver Hollow's heartbeat was slow, hidden in the tap of spoon against cup, the hush of boots dragging across welcome mats, the murmur of conversations that never grew loud. Thomas Hale returned to Molly's diner every night that week. He never said he would, never called ahead. But just after 9, the Ford would roll up in its same spot near the lamppost, the engine would sigh, and Asher would leap down, stretching his scarred limbs before waiting for the door to be opened. Each time they entered, the bell above the frame rang low and metallic, as if recognizing them. Inside, everything remained the same. The cracked tiles, the long counter with coffee pots that never seemed to empty, and the faint smell of fried onions lingering in the vents. And always June Miller. June had a kind of silence around her that didn't demand attention, but somehow always held it. She wasn't invisible, but she moved as though she wished she were. Her limp seemed worse on colder nights, and her face pale with exhaustion. But she never failed to offer a glass of water without a sound, or to nod when Thomas said, "Just coffee." Asher took to sitting under Thomas's booth with his chin resting on his paws, but his eyes followed June. Every step she took, every wince she tried to hide, he saw it. And every so often, when she came near, Asher would rise, nuzzle lightly against her leg or hand, his way of saying, "I see you." June never flinched. She simply allowed it, as though it had been far too long since anything in her life approached without hurting. That night, the diner was quieter than usual. A soft jazz song played on a dusty radio near the kitchen. In the back corner, a little girl with tangled brown curls sat alone, a crayon clutched in her mittened hand. Her name was Rebecca, and she had been coming to the diner every evening for a week. She never spoke much, just sat in the booth with a coloring book and an untouched plate of fries. Sometimes an older woman, presumably a foster worker or neighbor, dropped her off. No one really knew. Rebecca was 8, thin, pale from the cold, and wore a red puffer jacket with a broken zipper. Her eyes were hazel and heavy with the kind of quiet most children didn't carry. But when Asher walked by her table for the first time, she looked up, and something softened. She didn't smile, but she reached out a hand small, uncertain, and let it rest on his fur. He sat beside her for a full minute before returning to Thomas. That night, something shifted. At 10:15, June disappeared into the back kitchen. She didn't come out. Thomas noticed first when another waitress, a tall, no-nonsense woman named Cassie, grumbled, "Where'd June go? This burger's been waiting too long." Cassie had worked at Molly's for nearly 12 years. She had strong arms from lifting crates, a permanent scowl that covered deep loyalty, and a sharp tongue that hid an even sharper heart. She didn't dislike June, but she didn't ask questions either. Asher stood up under the table, tail stiff, nose in the air. He turned toward the kitchen and let out one low, urgent bark. Thomas stood immediately. "What is it?" Cassie asked. Asher barked again, this time sharper. He pushed against the kitchen door with his snout, forcing it open enough to slip inside. Thomas followed, heart quickening. Behind the door was heat, the clatter of pans, the hum of refrigerators. Then silence. At the far end, near the dry storage room, June was collapsed on the floor, one hand clutched around her right leg. A pan lay nearby, half full of oil. Her breath was shallow, sweat beaded on her forehead, and her eyes were half closed in confusion. Thomas dropped to one knee beside her. "June, hey, can you hear me?" She stirred faintly, her lips forming words he couldn't catch. Cassie appeared a second later, eyes wide. "Oh, hell. What happened? She fall again?" Thomas didn't answer. He looked down at Asher, who stood protectively beside her, tail straight, ears sharp. The dog pressed his nose to her cheek once more, then licked the sweat from her temple. Cassie knelt on the other side, already unwrapping the makeshift brace. "Same damn leg. Of course." June's eyelids fluttered. "I'm fine," she mumbled. "You're not," Cassie snapped. "I told you to sit after your shift." Thomas stood. "I'll take her to the clinic." "You know she won't go," Cassie said, her voice quieter now. "Hasn't in years." Thomas didn't reply. Instead, he pulled off his jacket and rolled it into a makeshift cushion. He gently slid it beneath June's head. Rebecca had appeared in the doorway, peering through the crack. She didn't say anything, but she held something in her hand. Slowly, she approached Thomas and Asher, holding out a folded piece of notebook paper. He opened it. A child's drawing. Asher was in the center, standing tall in front of a fire drawn in orange crayon. Behind him stood a girl with long hair, June, clearly smiling. The title read, Asher, the Guardian. Thomas blinked slowly. "Did you draw this?" Rebecca nodded, then whispered, "He always watches her." He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. "Thank you." Later, after June was carried into the back to rest, and Cassie insisted on taking over the shift, Thomas sat with Asher near the window. Rebecca climbed into the booth across from them. Asher rested his head on her lap, and she stroked his fur quietly. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, there was something almost like peace. The morning after June collapsed in the kitchen, Silver Hollow awoke to a thick, blue-tinged fog. Snow had hardened overnight, and a brittle crust of ice blanketed the roads and rooftops, muting even the birds. Thomas Hale didn't return to Molly's diner that morning. He had other plans. After feeding Asher and watching him drink from the tin bowl he always set down by the porch, Thomas slid into his truck, the same quiet determination etched into his face that had once moved boardrooms. Asher, sensing something different in his routine, leapt into the passenger seat without waiting for a command. They didn't drive toward the diner, but instead took a turn down Elm Ridge Road, toward the legal district in the next county. On the way, Thomas replayed the night before in his head. June on the floor, fevered and murmuring, and Rebecca's drawing still tucked in his coat pocket. The line in his mind repeated itself like a heartbeat. He always watches her. And Asher had. Even now, the dog sat upright in the seat, ears up, eyes forward, alert not with aggression, but focus, like he, too, knew this day mattered. At precisely 10 o'clock a.m., Thomas pushed open the glass door of a modest two-story law office nestled between a flower shop and a closed-down bookstore. The faded gold letters on the frosted glass read, Marla Teague, Attorney at Law. Inside, the office was warm but cramped, lined with dusty file cabinets and overburdened bookshelves. Behind the front desk sat a thin, elderly receptionist named Edith, wearing a knitted shawl and glasses chained around her neck. She looked up with slow recognition. "Mr. Hale," she said with a small smile, "Miss Teague is expecting you. Go on in." Asher lay down just beside the reception desk, his chin on his paws. Edith reached down and gave him a small scratch behind the ears. "Still got that calm about him, huh?" "Always," Thomas said, then pushed through the oak door into the back office. Marla Teague was in her early 60s, broad-shouldered, with thick, curly silver hair cropped to the chin. She wore a navy blazer with a lapel pin of a hawk's feather, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years defending small-town nobodies from big-city silence. She had once been Elena's friend Elena, Thomas's late wife, and still called him Hale instead of Thomas. She offered no pleasantries, only the click of a pen and a nod toward the chair. "What's got you out of the woods?" she asked, arching a silver brow. "A girl," Thomas said, then clarified. "A young woman, working at a diner. No ID, no insurance, no bank account, not even a paper trail." Marla blinked. "You think she's undocumented?" "No," he said, then paused. "I think someone made her disappear on paper." He pulled from his coat a folded napkin, inside which he had scrawled June's full name, June Elizabeth Miller. Marla tapped her keyboard slowly. Nothing came up, she frowned. "She works where?" "Molly's Diner." Marla sat back in her chair. "That dump still running?" "Barely." She clicked again, then reached for a file drawer, flipping through printouts and stapled records. Nothing recent, no tax forms, but one reference, a medical reimbursement from 2013, filed under a minor's name, June E. Miller. A foot injury sustained during a fall in a commercial kitchen. A partial settlement of $38,000 through Hayes Insurance. "That's it?" Thomas asked. "That's the only official trace of her I've got," Marla said. "But that's enough." Meanwhile, out in the lobby, Asher stirred. Edith, who had resumed her crossword, looked down at him curiously. The dog had sat up, head tilted. Then he stood, walked over to the door of Marla's office and whined a low, urgent sound. "Odd dog," Edith murmured, rising just as the office door cracked open and Thomas poked his head out. "Something wrong?" Edith asked. "Asher doesn't usually make noise unless—" Thomas paused, then looked back at Marla's desk. She had just dropped a folder onto a pile of documents. One paper fluttered free and landed face down on the floor. Asher barked sharply. Once. Thomas stepped inside, retrieved the page, and turned it over. It was the signature page of the 2013 settlement. The claimant's name was written in neat cursive, June Miller. But Thomas, who had seen June write out a food order just days ago, frowned. The J curled the wrong way. The E was looped with a flourish June never used. "This isn't her signature," he said. Marla turned the document toward her. "No, it's not." She rifled through a few more pages and found the co-signed name, Margaret Ann Miller, June's aunt, the owner of the diner. Marla leaned back. "Looks like we found our ghost." Back at Molly's Diner that evening, things looked unchanged, but something in the air felt taut. Rebecca was there again, seated in her usual corner. This time she was coloring on the back of a receipt with a dull orange crayon. Asher went to her first. She smiled when she saw him, then reached into her small backpack and pulled out something wrapped in tissue, a crumpled drawing of the diner, with a glowing heart drawn over the kitchen. "She got hurt there," Rebecca said, but no one cared. Asher sat beside her, steady and still. June came out from the kitchen a moment later, limping more than usual but smiling faintly when she saw Asher. Thomas, already seated, watched her carefully. "Busy today?" he asked gently. "Not really," she said. "Fries and frostbite, that's all." When she turned back toward the kitchen, Thomas stood. "I know what happened in 2013, he said softly. She froze. "I saw the documents," he added. "I think you were owed something you never received." June's shoulders slumped, but she didn't respond. Asher walked up beside her and leaned gently into her thigh. Her hand dropped automatically to his head. "I'm not here to force anything," Thomas said, "but I want to help, if you'll let me." She said nothing, just stood there with Asher beside her, and the sound of a crayon scratching in the background. It was a Thursday when the illusion cracked. The sun hadn't risen properly, just smeared pale gray light across the snow-packed streets of Silver Hollow. A fresh storm was expected by evening, but for now the air held stillness, the kind that comes before something gives. Inside Molly's Diner, the usual rhythms clattered on. Spatulas scraped against grills, mugs clinked against saucers, and the old radio near the kitchen whispered classic country songs through soft static. Thomas Hale sat in his booth by the window, watching the street through fogged glass. Asher rested at his feet, tail curled, ears flicking occasionally at the sound of a pan dropping or the doorbell jingling. The diner was unusually full, locals escaping the cold or regulars following habit. Among them was Mr. O'Neill, a retired forest ranger in his 70s with a red wool hat, wrinkled tan face, and a deep, croaky laugh. He always sat at the counter, told long stories no one had the time to hear, and occasionally passed peppermint sticks to the servers. Behind the counter that morning stood Molly Harper, owner of the diner and June's maternal aunt. She was a stout woman in her late 50s, with a tightly pinned bun of graying blonde hair and deep lines around her mouth that suggested smiling had long gone out of fashion. Her floral apron was immaculate, though she never cooked or served. She was the kind of woman who made rules loudly and exceptions silently, often for a price. Molly had built the diner from her late husband's insurance money and a loan from the town's old bank, and she wore that fact like a badge. She spoke to customers with an oily politeness but snapped at employees with the precision of a seasoned drill sergeant. June, her niece, was the only one who never snapped back. That morning, June moved slowly from table to table, limping more than usual. She had refused to take the previous evening off, despite Cassie's urging, insisting she was fine. Her hair was tied in a quick, messy knot, and her eyes looked heavier, the bruising beneath more pronounced. Asher watched her closely, occasionally shifting his head to follow her movement. Midway through her shift, June approached Molly with a quiet request for a break. Her voice was low, respectful. "I just need 10 minutes," she said, "to rest the brace." Molly looked at her, then deliberately raised her voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "You need 10 minutes? For what? Sympathy? This ain't a shelter, June. It's a job. Or have you forgotten who gave you that roof?" June's face flushed. "I haven't forgotten." "No," Molly sneered, "because every dime you owe me reminds you, doesn't it?" At that moment, Thomas stood. He moved slowly to the counter, placing a folded document on top, a photocopy of the 2013 insurance payout form with both signatures June's forged. Molly glanced at it, not touching it. "June didn't see a cent, did she?" Thomas asked, voice steady. Molly's eyes didn't waver. "She lived here, ate my food, slept under my roof. She was 17. She was lucky." Thomas didn't answer. Asher rose and came to stand beside him, his amber eyes fixed on Molly. June stood frozen near the coffee machine, her hands shaking. "I'm not accusing you," Thomas said. "I'm asking you to make it right." Molly gave a short laugh. "Make it right? With who? You? The stray dog you dragged in?" At that, she raised her arm maybe to shoo Asher away, maybe just to point, but the motion was too fast, too sharp. Asher stepped forward and growled a low, guttural sound that made the room fall silent. Not a bark, not a snap, but a sound that said, "Enough." Molly froze. Her arm hung midair for a beat too long before she lowered it. Thomas gently placed a hand on Asher's back. The dog didn't lunge, didn't move. He simply stood, breathing hard through his nose, unwavering. Everyone had stopped eating. Even Mr. O'Neill turned from his counter seat, one peppermint stick halfway to his mouth. Cassie stepped out from the kitchen. "Is everything all right?" Molly cleared her throat. "Perfectly fine," she said tightly. "Just a misunderstanding." Thomas backed away, guiding Asher with a quiet word. June still hadn't moved. It was only after things resumed the clink of plates, the static of the radio, that Rebecca walked over. She had been sitting in her usual spot, knees tucked under her, drawing something on the back of a takeout menu. She wore a green puffer jacket that didn't quite zip, and her cheeks were red from the cold. She looked up at June, then Asher. "Was that true?" she asked. "About the money?" June nodded slowly. Rebecca looked down. "I knew he was special. Asher." "You think he's a hero?" June asked softly, her voice hollowed. "He saved my cousin," Rebecca said. 3 years ago, during the wildfires near Eagle Rock. She was stuck behind the barn, and the wind turned. My uncle said it was too late, but Asher, he found her. She said all she saw was fire and this big dog running through it like it didn't matter." June's breath caught. She crouched down beside Rebecca. "How do you know it was him?" Rebecca pulled a small, water-stained photo from her pocket. It showed a younger Asher, chest deep in smoke, harness still strapped to his back, eyes focused forward. "That's him," she said. "I never forget faces that save people." June looked at Asher, who now sat calmly near the counter again, tail flicking, tongue out as if none of it had happened. She reached out and stroked the top of his head slowly. It was the first time she had done so without flinching. "Thank you," she whispered, not just to the dog, but to whatever force had sent him walking into her life through a snowy night. Snowfall had returned to Silver Hollow, not with the violent force of a storm, but the quiet insistence of something that refused to be ignored. Each flake drifted as if carrying weight, blanketing the streets, the cars, the rooftops, until the whole town seemed buried under the heaviness of unspoken things. Inside Molly's diner, the heater wheezed as it fought back the cold. Outside, frost clung to the window edges like a frame around the silence within. Thomas Hale had spent most of that day in the town records office, poring over old banking statements and digital archives. He was quiet but efficient, the kind of man who didn't waste words or motion. At 58, he still carried himself with the restrained precision of someone used to knowing exactly when to speak and when to listen. And now, he had something solid. He sat at the diner's back booth that evening, a manila envelope resting beside his coffee. Asher lay at his feet, eyes open, muscles still. The German shepherd had grown more alert these past few days, as if sensing the weight shifting around them. Rebecca had already come and gone. Her foster guardian, a kind, soft-voiced woman named Nora Green, had stopped by to pick her up. Nora, in her early 40s, wore wool sweaters and handmade earrings, and always ordered 2 hot chocolates, one for Rebecca, one for the road. She smiled at Asher each time and said he reminded her of the ranger dogs from her childhood in Montana. June worked quietly that night, avoiding Thomas's booth. Her face was pale but composed, her limp slightly less severe thanks to a new wrap Cassie had insisted on applying. But her eyes, those pale gray-blue eyes, kept flicking toward the envelope. It wasn't until closing time, when the last stool was flipped and the grill scrubbed raw, that Thomas rose and approached her. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. June glanced around, made sure Molly was nowhere near, then nodded and led him toward the pantry in the back. Thomas opened the envelope and laid out 3 sheets of paper on the metal prep table. One was a scanned copy of the 2013 injury payout from Hayes Insurance. The second, a bank statement from Molly's diner account dated the same month. The third, a receipt of a $28,000 renovation bill for kitchen improvement made within 2 weeks of the deposit. "She used it," Thomas said. "All of it. You never saw a dollar." June didn't look surprised. Her lips tightened, her shoulders slumped. "You need to bring this forward," he said gently. June shook her head. "I can't." "She stole from you." "She raised me," June said flatly. "She fed me, put a roof over me. If I do this, she'll kick me out. I'll have nothing." Thomas wanted to argue, but Asher moved first. The old dog stood, walked to the closed door of the pantry, and scratched at it gently once, then again. He walked over to June and sat in front of her, lifting his head. In his mouth was a folded piece of cloth, a small kitchen towel, old and faintly stained. June recognized it immediately. It was the same towel she'd wrapped around her ankle the night of her fall 10 years ago. The night she'd crawled across the slick floor, teeth clenched, afraid to cry out because Molly hated noise. Somehow, Asher had found it among the cleaning rags and brought it to her, now soft, frayed, and still marked faintly with brown red. She stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. Then she reached down and took the towel, fingers trembling. "I almost died that night," she whispered. "You didn't," Thomas said. "Because you held on. Because someone should have been there for you. Now someone is." From her apron pocket, June pulled out a folded slip of construction paper, silent and small. She handed it to Thomas. Inside was a child's crayon drawing, a bold image of Asher standing tall between June and a looming figure with sharp, crooked hands. Rebecca's handwriting was on the front. "You're the reason she's still here." Thomas read it, then looked up. "There are things in this world that don't need words," he said. "Only action." June nodded once, the towel clutched tightly in her palm. That night, she didn't sleep in the little cot in the attic. Instead, she stayed downstairs with Asher curled beside her on the faded sofa in the break room. She stared at the ceiling for hours, eyes open, breath steady. When the early gray light of dawn reached the diner windows, she stood. Quietly, she took the envelope Thomas had left on the table and tucked it into her canvas messenger bag. The snow was falling again. But this time, June stepped outside and didn't shiver. The storm rolled in without warning. By nightfall, Silver Hollow was locked in a whiteout. Wind tore through alleyways like a live thing, howling around corners and rattling loose shingles. Flakes the size of coins slammed into windows and smothered headlights, and by 10 p.m., even the few regulars who braved the cold were huddled indoors. The streets emptied. Porch lights flickered. The world turned quiet, buried in cold. Inside Molly's diner, the tension was anything but quiet. The shift had started with silence, the kind that cracks beneath the surface. June moved from booth to booth with practiced ease, but everyone felt something different in the air. Cassie, working grill that night, kept glancing toward the counter. Mr. O'Neill had come in early for pie and coffee but left quickly, sensing the wrong kind of electricity. Even Nora Green, who stopped by briefly with Rebecca, paused at the door and muttered to Thomas, "Something's off tonight." Thomas Hale sat at his usual booth, Asher at his feet. The envelope of legal documents now rested in the pocket of his wool coat. He had filed the formal complaint that morning through Marla Teague's office. It was done. But Molly knew. She stormed out from the back around 9:30 p.m., her floral apron spotted with flour, her eyes wide with fury. The diner was nearly empty, just Thomas, Cassie, and June, who stood by the sink rinsing mugs. Molly didn't speak first. She slammed her palm against the counter. "I knew it," she barked, voice thick. "You've been plotting this behind my back." Thomas stood slowly, keeping his voice measured. "It wasn't behind your back. It was in front of the law." June turned, confused, then froze. Molly's glare shifted to her. "You think you can just walk away? After everything I gave you? You ungrateful little—" "Molly," Cassie warned, stepping forward. But Molly didn't stop. "You're fired. Get out of my diner. Pack your things and go." Thomas stepped between them. Asher rose and moved forward too, body tense, watching Molly. His breath was slow, tail unmoving. "I said get out," Molly repeated, pointing at the door. June stared, unmoving. Thomas turned to her. "I'll drive you. You're not staying out in this." June shook her head. "No, I just need a minute." She took off her apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the counter. Her movements were slow, deliberate. The moment she stepped outside, the wind hit her like a wave. Thomas grabbed his coat and followed, but she was already gone, swallowed into the dark street. The snow came harder then, thick bands of white spinning like threads through the air. June walked with her head down, her limp more severe without support. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that she couldn't go back. By the time she reached the corner of Ashburn Street, her fingers had gone numb. She stumbled. The world tilted sideways, the snow brighter than it should have been. Then darkness. At this diner, Asher paced. He didn't sit, didn't settle. He pawed at the door once, then again. When Thomas didn't respond, he let out a sharp bark once, then twice. Thomas opened the door. The wind slammed against him. Asher shot into the storm, nose to the ground, vanishing into the dark. "Wait!" Thomas called, grabbing gloves and flashlight, but someone else moved faster. Rebecca. She had returned to the diner with Nora, hoping to drop off another crayon drawing. When she saw Asher run, she didn't hesitate. The little girl, all of 10 years old, ran into the street after him, tears already in her eyes. "Where's he going?" Nora shouted, breathless. "He's looking for June," Thomas said, buttoning his coat. "He'll find her." The snow was knee-deep now. Asher pushed forward, moving with focused speed. His nose caught the faintest trace of her scent beneath the layers, sweat, leather, cinnamon from the soap she used. Each step forward was a battle against the wind, but he didn't stop. Not when his paws burned, not when the cold bit his ears. Rebecca followed as far as she could, her small boots slipping. Thomas reached her in time and scooped her up into his arms. "You're okay," he whispered. "Asher's got her." Minutes passed. Then, from across the intersection, a bark sharp, urgent. Thomas turned the flashlight, its beam slicing through snow, and there they were. Asher stood over a collapsed figure, tail high, barking until he saw Thomas. June lay curled against a snowbank, face flushed with cold, her breath short and shallow. Thomas rushed forward, knelt beside her, felt her wrist, faint but steady. He pulled off his coat, wrapped it around her, and whispered, "I've got you." Rebecca knelt beside Asher, throwing her arms around the dog, sobbing into his fur. "You found her. You found her." Lights flicked on in surrounding houses. Windows opened. Faces appeared behind curtains. One by one, townspeople stepped outside, some with blankets, others with thermoses of tea and cocoa. Nora waved them over, calling out, "It's June! She collapsed!" Neighbors moved. They brought warmth, words, the kind of community that hadn't spoken up before but could no longer look away. That night, June stayed at Thomas's cabin. Nora insisted on driving Rebecca home, but promised to return the next morning. Asher lay at the foot of the couch where June slept, tail thumping gently against the floor each time she stirred. Thomas sat in the armchair beside her, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The wind howled outside, but the fire inside crackled, steady. It took nearly 3 months for the dust to settle. The court case, though quiet and swift, had rippled through Silver Hollow like a breath held too long. When the verdict came down favoring June Miller, confirming the misappropriated settlement and officially severing her legal ties to Molly Harper, people didn't cheer. They simply nodded, as though something righteous had finally righted itself. Molly, stripped of her veneer of respectability, continued to operate the diner for a short while, but the seats stayed empty. Mr. O'Neill stopped coming. Nora and Rebecca never returned. Cassie gave her notice 2 weeks later and started working mornings at the local bakery. One by one, Silver Hollow stepped back from the place, not out of vengeance, but because silence no longer suited them. For June, it wasn't about revenge. It was about air-clean, unfiltered air and the right to breathe it without asking permission. With the settlement finally in her account, she made her first withdrawal modest. Enough to rent a sunlit corner unit above the old sewing supply store on Sycamore Lane, and enough to open the space she'd once only imagined, a tea shop called Ember and Leaf. The name came to her late one night, seated at Thomas Hale's kitchen table, Asher snoring near the fire, and Rebecca sprawled across 2 mismatched cushions with a comic book open on her lap. June had whispered the words, "Ember for what survived the burning, and leaf for what grows after." The building itself was narrow, a former bookstore long abandoned, with bay windows that curved inward like a welcoming arm. Thomas helped with repairs, patching drywall, sanding shelves, while Asher lay at the entrance, tail thudding gently as passers-by peeked in to watch the transformation. Marla Teague loaned her old teacups, hand-painted in cobalt and gold, from her attic. Nora brought over repurposed wooden stools. Cassie stopped by with fresh scones every Friday morning, and Rebecca, now a permanent resident in June's home, painted the sign with her own hands. On opening day, the town came, not all at once, not in a crowd, but steadily quiet figures wrapped in scarves and long coats, faces pink from cold, hands holding coins or folded bills. They didn't come for the tea, though it was good. They came because something had been bruised in Silver Hollow, and June's tea shop had become the place to mend it. June, now 29 and walking with the help of a custom orthopedic brace, wore a linen apron and kept her hair loosely braided down her back. Her posture had changed, shoulders higher, eyes steadier. She still moved quietly, but no longer as if trying to disappear. Asher had his usual spot by the window. A woolen mat embroidered with the words "Welcome Home" lay beneath him. He was older now, his muzzle touched with gray, but his eyes were bright, ears sharp. Children would sit beside him with picture books or cups of apple cider. Some whispered secrets into his ear. He never moved, only listened. On the morning of the grand opening, a thin blanket of snow had dusted the ground. Rebecca, now officially Rebecca Miller, wore her favorite red coat and a knit hat too big for her head. She stood in the middle of the shop, one hand gripping a ribbon-wrapped box. "I have something," she declared, "for Asher." She knelt beside the old German shepherd and opened the box, revealing a folded red scarf hand-stitched, with uneven seams and a few clumsy hearts sewn into the corner. Gently, she wrapped it around Asher's neck. "You're the real hero," she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You saved her, and me too." The room hushed for a second, a reverent silence broken only by the soft crackle of the fireplace and the rustle of teacups being set down. June wiped her eyes with the hem of her apron. Thomas, standing near the back with a mug in hand, smiled faintly and said nothing, just raised his cup in quiet tribute. That day, Ember and Leaf sold out of everything. But it wasn't the tea people remembered. It was the girl in red hugging a dog in the middle of a warm room. It was the fire that hadn't died. It was late February when the snowfall in Silver Hollow began to change. no longer heavy and oppressive, but soft and aimless, the kind that spun lazily through the air like it had nowhere else to be. The streets were quieter now, not because of absence, but because peace had taken up residence in the town's corners. People walked slower. They nodded more. The silence had become less about what was hidden and more about what was finally allowed to rest. At the center of Sycamore Lane, the little tea shop, Ember and Leaf, was glowing with its usual warmth. Its windows were fogged with breath and steam, soft light glowing from within like a lantern. The scent of honey, lavender, and cinnamon drifted out onto the sidewalk every time the door opened. The closed sign now read, "Come in anyway if you need," scrawled in Rebecca's neat handwriting with a crayon heart beneath it. Inside, the familiar soundscape hummed, the clink of cups, the low hiss of steeping kettles, the occasional burst of quiet laughter. The back corner, however, held a sacred kind of stillness. Thomas Hale sat at his usual table near the window, a worn, leather-bound journal open beside him. He was dressed in his olive wool coat, the collar slightly dusted with snow, his hair now fully gray at the temples. His face bore the calmness of someone who had made peace with his ghosts. A steaming cup of chamomile rested near his elbow, untouched for the moment. Across from him, June poured tea into a pale ceramic cup with steady hands. Her movements had changed. They were no longer tentative or guarded, but sure, thoughtful, like every motion was part of something she had chosen. She wore a dark blue apron over a soft gray sweater, and her auburn hair was pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. A delicate silver necklace with a single small pendant glinted beneath the fabric's edge. At her feet, curled like a sentinel in repose, lay Asher. The old German shepherd now bore the signs of his age more clearly, his joints slower, his muzzle more salt than pepper, but there was no mistaking the strength in his posture. He lay with his head resting gently on Rebecca's leg, as the girl sat cross-legged on the rug beside him, scribbling in a math workbook. Her face was scrunched in concentration, tongue slightly poking from the side of her mouth. Rebecca had grown in those last few months. Now 11, she carried herself with more certainty. Her brown hair was longer, always tied back with a red ribbon, her favorite color since the day she tied that same hue around Asher's neck. She still wore that puffy red coat when it was cold, though now the sleeves just brushed her wrists. There was a spark in her that hadn't been there before, one born of safety, of having a place, of being chosen. Thomas reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew a small velvet pouch. Without a word, he laid it on the table in front of June. She looked at it, curious but calm. "What's this?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a sip of his tea, then said quietly, "Elena wore that every day after her diagnosis. She said it reminded her that love isn't about holding on, it's about letting someone become who they're meant to be." June slowly opened the pouch and drew out a fine silver chain, at the center of which hung a small antique compass pendant. It was delicate, not ornate, its face worn from years of being touched, turned and clutched in the hand of a woman who had faced uncertainty with courage. "She said," Thomas continued, voice growing softer, "that if she couldn't stay to guide me, then I should pass the compass on to someone who could find their own way." June didn't speak. Her fingers closed gently around the pendant. Asher stirred, lifting his head to look at her. Then, after a long pause, he gave a soft, low bark, just one, and let his head rest again, his amber eyes never leaving her face. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside, time seemed to pause. From the back of the shop, a man entered, a quiet customer who had only recently begun visiting Ember and Leaf. His name was Daniel Brooks, a widowed carpenter with gentle eyes and calloused hands, known for building birdhouses and refusing payment for his work. He carried a bouquet of dried lavender wrapped in brown paper, which he handed to June with a small, bashful nod. She thanked him with a warm smile, placed the bouquet in a vase, and offered him tea on the house. Rebecca, watching the exchange, leaned toward Thomas and whispered, "Do you think she'll be okay?" Thomas didn't answer directly. Instead, he closed the journal beside him and murmured, "She already is." That afternoon, the shop remained open longer than usual. A few high school students filtered in with poetry books. Nora arrived with fresh lemon cookies. Even Cassie stopped by, still wearing flour on her shirt and smiling behind her ever-present sarcasm. As dusk fell, a golden hush settled over the shop. June lit the sconces one by one, their glow casting dancing shadows across the walls. Thomas stood to leave. Before he opened the door, he looked back. June had returned to the counter. Rebecca was still nestled beside Asher, and the dog, though older, sat tall, now watchful, proud, at peace. Thomas placed a hand on the doorknob, then looked at the compass still around June's neck. "Some things," he said softly, "aren't about being saved. They're about choosing to live." He left into the quiet evening, snow soft underfoot. Inside, Asher let out one final breath, long and calm, his tail thudding once against the floor. Rebecca reached down and stroked behind his ear. "We're okay now," she whispered. "All of us." Sometimes, what saves us isn't lightning or thunder. It's the quiet loyalty of a soul that refuses to give up on us. Asher, an old German shepherd, didn't speak. He didn't argue. But through snowstorms and silence, betrayal and healing, he stood by June, protecting her not with power, but with presence. That, too, is a miracle. This story reminds us that God's miracles don't always come as flashes of light from the sky. Sometimes they come as a dog waiting by the door, a child's quiet drawing, a neighbor's warm cup of tea, a compass passed down from a lost love. In our daily lives, we often overlook the gentle ways God reaches us, the moments we're held, seen, and not forgotten. If you've ever felt lost, broken, or voiceless, remember, the miracle may already be beside you, walking through the snow, never asking for thanks. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who needs encouragement. Comment Amen if you believe God sends us protectors when we need them most. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of hope, faith, and quiet redemption. Pray for those who feel invisible today, that they too will find their Asher. May God bless you, guide you, and send His love in unexpected forms. Sometimes He sends angels, sometimes He sends dogs.